Okay, everybody, well, welcome back for this final plenary session of today. And this is the session where what we've done is to bring together an academic and some policymakers and some public administration folk to really answer the question, what are the implications of the Asian century for public administration and policymakers? So this is, as I said this morning, one of those sessions where we combine academic insight with public policy expertise, experience and nous, and really try to get to the heart of what all this might mean for policymaking and practice. To chair this session, I am very, very pleased to welcome Mr. Peter Harris, who's the chairman currently of the Productivity Commission. Peter was kind enough to come and have coffee with me earlier this year and to talk about the School of Government and to express enthusiasm for participating in its activities. And being the kind of person I am, I never forget when somebody makes me an offer like that. So this was a fine opportunity, I felt, to take him up on his offer of help, and he has kindly agreed to chair this session. Peter, as I say, is currently chairman of the Productivity Commission, but he's previously served as secretary of the Commonwealth Department of Broadband Communications and the Digital Economy, and the Victorian Government agencies responsible for sustainability and the environment, primary industries and public transport. His career with government started in 1976 with the Department of Overseas Trade and included periods with the Treasury, Finance, the Prime Minister's Department and Transport. And he worked for 2 years in the Prime Minister's office on secondment from the Prime Minister's Department as a member of the then Prime Minister, Bob Hawke's personal staff. In 2013, he was made an Officer of the Order of Australia for distinguished service to public administration through leadership and policy reform roles in the areas of telecommunications, the environment, primary industry and transport. And so he is extremely well placed both to manage the group of people we have on the panel, but to also facilitate this plenary discussion. So I'm very happy to hand over to Peter. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks very much. So in the true manner of chairman the world over, because I'm not just chairman of this session, I'm chairman of the Productivity Commission, so there'll be ruthless time management here imposed upon all speakers and necessity of identifying yourselves and all that kind of control freakery behaviour. Actually, I'm not actually very good at any of that at all, so this thing will probably run fairly soft and fairly informally, and then afterwards you'll all say on those little forms you have to fill out how much you really enjoyed that kind of style of things. Now, as a bit of discipline for our speakers, you're required when you chair a session, just in case the speakers don't fill up enough time in Q&A, the questions, to bring along a few notes of your own. So I've done a few notes of your own. I've also done a slide, and there'll be some discussion of dependency ratios in Asian environment, things like that. Or you could just take that as an incentive to keep the questions going and for everybody to speak. Because you don't want to be bored by me talking about dependency ratio. Well, you might, I don't know, some people in the audience might actually be interested. So we have four fine speakers here this afternoon, and we'll try and do it in the order it's in the program, which is David Hanna. To start off, David is Director of Business Strategy at Monash University, but he's also Chair of IPA's Victoria's Asian Century Task Force, and he tells me he's appearing here today in that requirement primarily. David and I have worked together, including in Bob Hawke's office quite a few years ago, but also in the Victorian government at different points in time. So I know David very well. He's a very entertaining speaker, and he's got a lot of background in this area, and he spent a fair time in a number of Asian locations, including in China and Singapore. So David, do you want to start us off? I'm told that it's roughly 10 minutes, so I'll keep an eye on that and we'll see how we go.
I'm happy to do roughly 10 minutes, thanks Peter. And I should actually, as an indicator of how things have changed, the first thing Peter and I ever did working together in the public service was close down an illegal Fretland radio station operating in the Torres Strait, which at the time was regarded as good public policy and now would be regarded as a stain on our characters. But there you go. As public servants we do what the government asks us to do. Okay, I'm here in a number of capacities, and I'm, as Peter said, primarily in my role as chair of IPA's Asian Century Task Force. And I guess I'm been asked to do that partly because I was having coffee in Burke Street one day and moved too slowly, but also because I've got a passion for the Asian region. And in some ways, I want to bring one of the perspectives to start this off, which is a personal one, and I think my personal journey is rather similar to Australia's, not surprisingly, because in the early part of the second half of the 20th century I was pretty much the quintessential Australian person, Anglo-Saxon stock, middle class, going to the right sort of schools. in an upbringing dominated by England and the US, with a little bit of European spice thrown in for those who were truly adventurous. When I was at school, I studied French, German, Latin and ancient Greek, and I can't remember an Asian language being on the syllabus at that stage in Sydney. And then serendipitously and completely by accident, I found myself in Singapore for the last 2 years of my schooling on my own, on a scholarship, and that's where I grew up. And I also grew into this extraordinary place called Southeast Asia, and it's extended from there into Asia more broadly. I ended up, as a result of that, not just studying economics, but also studying Chinese at the ANU, just after Kevin Rudd, which was a galling experience because no one was ever as good as Kevin at Chinese. I was never going to be anywhere nearly as good as Kevin. He was genuinely good at Chinese, by the way. That's not a go at Kevin. But it was this cloud that you operated through. My role in government has been primarily in industry policy and international trade and engagement and the development of domestic industry policy matching into that. Particularly as Australia's focus has shifted from our historic region of Europe and more into our geographic region. I've now lived and worked in most of the major Chinese centres in Asia, school in Singapore, Hong Kong, Taipei and Beijing, various times. And I have to say it's extraordinary the change in Australia in that time, if you think about it. The late 70s with the arrival of large numbers of Vietnamese refugees, working through the domestic economic reforms of the 80s that saw us opening our economy to the world, and the first bit that flowed in, of course, really was Asia, and then on to the China boom of the 2000s. I like to think we've turned from essentially an inward-looking insular Anglo-European society into an increasingly outward-looking, open, global one, but I think we've still got an awfully long way to go, but I'm very optimistic about it. It's been said often in recent years that we are indeed fortunate to be located in this part of the world, and I believe that is true. But there are challenges for the country, for governments, and for us as individuals and public administrators, which is the angle I want to come from, if we're to reap the full measure of benefits that are on offer. The so-called Asian century will see that locus of economic activity globally continue its move towards rapidly growing Asian economies, but not exclusively so, as one of the earliest sessions I was in discussed. And for this, I think we're reasonably well placed to manage the implications and continue to secure economic benefits, although there will certainly be challenges ahead. But we'll also see a shift in the global geopolitical balance, and for that I think we're clearly much less well placed. And we only have to look at the difficulties that the new Australian government is having in managing its relationships with Indonesia and China to see that. And I don't mean that to be a particular criticism of the Abbott government, by the way. I suspect they've been getting and largely following the same advice as their predecessors. But the ground is shifting, not just in China, but we're seeing that in Indonesia as well. And we'll need to be considerably more flexible and adroit, I think, in how we see and manage our relationships in Asia, for want of a better shorthand descriptor in the future. And to do that, we'll need to be more open in how we think about the difference between us and in what we regard as the best or the right way of doing things. We'll need to learn about each of the countries that make up Asia, a European concept, let us remember, that masks a deep complexity and wide diversity of cultures. We need, frankly, to treat them, all the Asian countries, with more respect, obvious respect, and to listen more and be prepared to learn more from them and with them. The immediate reason why I'm sitting here today actually is because of a discussion I led at an IPA-led Thai delegation of public administrators, and having given them the full bottle on what the Victorian government was doing, for whom I was working at the time, in response to the Asian century, I actually said, "So, and what are you guys doing as a matter of interest?" And they said, "Oh, Asia's too big for us. Southeast Asia's a real puzzle, so we're working on that." And they were primarily concerned with deepening their understanding and their ability to engage effectively with their ASEAN partners. And I thought that was a really interesting comment, that we really do need to get a little bit, have a handle on the perspective. And I argued long in the Victorian government that talking about things like China strategy and India strategies made little or no sense. It's just too big. In Victoria, we've got a 33-year now sister state relationship with Jiangsu province. That's a rich one. It's roughly proportionate, if indeed the state of Victoria can be proportionate with an economy and a society about the size of Germany. Even then, I'm concerned it's too big for us, but we've got a rich investment in that. We need to be proportionate in the way we think about this, and we need to be clever in the way we think about it. And I think there's an underlying arrogance in the way Australians think about their importance in the world, particularly in relation to Asia, and we tend to try and eat the elephant, which is not a smart thing to try and do when you're not that large. And having now departed entirely from my notes, I'll try and find out where I was. Okay, so this is about learning to engage more effectively with Asia and developing a more obvious respect and listening more and learning more. To do this, I think it's really important for us as individuals and public administrators to do more, to take the time, to make the effort to not just to learn their languages, but to read and think about their histories, to have spent time with them and in their countries, so that we can develop the deep levels of understandings that will help us navigate our way through those inevitable shoals and currents of the international relationships that we're seeking to develop successfully. And these are long-term commitments that we make. There are many of us who've done those with Europe and with North America. We've studied richly of their literature and their histories, and we need to be doing the same thing with the Asian countries if we genuinely believe these are going to be important partners in our future. It still amazes me that people choose to go to the Kennedy School of Government rather than the Lee Kuan Yew School of Government, for example. If we were really serious about focusing on Asia, we would be going to places where we're surrounded by the up-and-coming leaders of Asian countries and being trained by their trainers and educated by their educators and getting the insights that you can only get by spending time, rich time, with those people in situ. But I think there are some hopeful signs on this. There are decisions by governments to invest in developing these capabilities. There are language programs like the Victorian Government's Hamer Scholarships, and I'll add a disclaimer that I played a part in the development of these. The opening of new presences in Asian countries, and we've seen almost all Victoria's new presences overseas being opened in Asian countries over the last decade. And in broader initiatives that help develop a rich range of capabilities and knowledge that we'll need to be able to engage successfully. I think AsiaLink's National Centre for Asia Capability is a really exciting development and one that we ought to be putting ourselves into. But the Australia-India Institute at the University of Melbourne and the newly announced Australia-Indonesia Centre at Monash University are also going to be very important contributions to developing the knowledge and basis upon which we can build those relationships. But I think it's also critical that more public administrators in Australia become acquainted with the way government is thought of, is constructed and works in Asian countries. It's generally speaking not exactly the same as the liberal representative democracy that we're used to, flowing out of our historical connections to the West. And we'll need to work out how the different approaches can best work together, and they will need to work together, and we will need to develop a rich, respectful relationship on this. And the way we talk about corruption, for example, in different countries will need to be a much more sophisticated conversation than has tended to be so in the past. And if you want examples of that, think about the way we've thought about corruption in our own history and things that were perfectly acceptable 2 centuries ago are completely not acceptable now. It's going to be the same sort of thing that we need to get flexible in the way we work together. I think the signs are good. I think there's a genuine and growing interest in understanding the differences and a respectful way of understanding it. IPA's National Congress last year had an Asian focus for the first time, and what was interesting was one of the big hits, completely unexpected really, was a presentation on Confucianism in China by Daniel Bell and what that means for the nature of government. And that really was just about the sellout performance, and it had people talking. It had people actually really grappling with those different insights that Daniel was able to bring, and I thought was a very exciting development. It was also a very deliberate decision on IPA's part that the keynote speaker for the first time was not only not an Australian, but was a leading administrator from Asia in Shashi Tharoor, who is not only a current member of the Indian Parliament, but has also been an international and domestic bureaucrat. So he was somebody who brought a rich insight into the nature of governance in the New World and the importance of Asian perspectives on that. And in closing, the Asian Century White Paper, I think, was an important statement of Australia's recognition of the changes that are underway and our commitment to making the most of them. Now, while that has been formally consigned to the National Archives, the new government will necessarily chart its own course, and I don't think there's any signs of a shift away from the importance of this focus, if anything to the contrary, but they will certainly do it in their own way. To do it successfully, they will look to public administrators and policy makers for advice. And I think the challenge for us is making sure that we are ready and able to give the best possible advice to them as they do that. Thank you.
Well, David's met his first performance criterion, which is to stay within the 10-minute limit. No, I don't have a thing to ding, so that was good, David. Good job.
Pleasure, Peter.
So we'll now be able to put John Richardson to the test. So John is Victorian State Director for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade here in Melbourne. He was appointed Director earlier this year, and previously to that he's been Ambassador to a suite of South American countries and Assistant Secretary in Canberra, responsible for Canada and Latin America branch, and also for development in relation to foreign policy in the Caribbean. So, John, please try and get us a quick 10-minute version.
Now, that's really certainly a tough task. I suppose what I could do is go through my notes and delete all of the references that David made, but that wouldn't actually leave me very much to say. I will start by saying, no, it is a pleasure to be here. One of the troubles with being on such a distinguished panel is that they will almost always anticipate what I had in mind to cover. But I would like to make a couple of points today about the Asia Century, the Australian Public Service and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And although I will focus on the APS, I do hope that my comments will be relevant as well to the broader public sector. I should stress that I'm speaking from a personal point of view. The first point I'd like to make is one I'm sure other speakers have made, that the term of the Asia Century is much overused. This is not a criticism of the organisers of this conference, because it is a very useful shorthand to describe the re-emergence of Asia as a region of first-order economic and strategic importance in its own right. But it does not mean that this century will belong to any one country or region. Economic weight and strategic influences are becoming more dispersed, and some of the new poles of power this century will clearly be outside Asia. However, the size of Asia's population means that it will likely to be unique in the scale of its economic growth. The second point is obvious. As a result of these changes, there is no doubt that Australia's future prosperity will be tied intimately to what happens in the region. But the re-emergence of Asia as an economic powerhouse has not gone unnoticed by other countries. And this leads to my third point. We will face increasing competition for access and influence in the region, not only from countries outside the region, but also from countries in the region. And this is something forgotten sometimes. Our competition for influence and access is also from countries which are already very familiar with the cultural norms and ways of doing business in Asia. My fourth point is that if we are to give ourselves a head start in the highly competitive stakes in Asia, we need to understand Asia, as David has highlighted. Its cultural norms and assumptions, the way its governments, its various business sectors, its private sectors operate and interact, the characteristics they value and the way in which they communicate, to name but a few aspects of Asia literacy. But Asia literacy is not just about language. The Asian Century White Paper described what is needed as Asia-relevant capability to try to better capture the fact that it is about a range of skills beyond just language. And on that point of language skills, I personally would argue that language skills do not automatically make one Asia literate. One can be highly Asia literate without having a language, but that lack will always place a limit on how Asia literate one can become. The idea of the importance of promoting Asian literacy lies at the heart of the Foreign Minister Bishop's centrepiece initiative of the new Colombo Plan, to be formally launched tomorrow, and designed to equip a new generation of Australian graduates with the practical skills and experience to operate highly effectively in Asian societies. Personally, I think the importance of the new Colombo Plan will go well beyond the immediate number of recipients. In a conversation I had just last week, I was struck by the comment that of those Australian students who undertake studies overseas, only around 17 to 20% do so in Asia. But I was also encouraged by the fact that the academic I was talking with said that his university was aiming to increase the proportion to over a third in the next 3 years. Hopefully the new Colombo Plan will not only benefit the direct recipients, but will also act as a powerful signal to other students about the value of considering study in Asia, not just the traditional destinations of Europe and America. My fifth point is that if we need to develop Asian literacy, not only in the universities, but systematically at both the private sector and the public sector levels. The 2012-13 APS State of the Service report, released last week, argued that an Asia-capable APS would be critical to Australia's success in the Asian century. It noted that as domestic and international issues become increasingly connected, more APS employees, including those working in domestically oriented agencies, will be required to work more closely with counterparts in Asia, and consequently will need to develop a more sophisticated understanding of Asia and Asian cultures in order to support the government's objectives in the region. It reported that 66% of agencies were directly engaged in Asia, but of these, only 42% said they felt they were well prepared, and 56% were only moderately prepared. 56%. I think it is worth noting a particular strength we bring to engagement with Asia is the cultural diversity of the Australian population. With about 1 in 11 Australians born in Asia, and a representation of around 8% in the APS, we have an enormous resource to draw on. Whether we do so as effectively as we might is another question. My sixth point is that if we are to be competitive in Asia, we need not only to be Asia literate. Our effectiveness will be increased to the extent that we are able to integrate our efforts in a whole of government approach. This idea, of course, lies behind the reason the government decided to merge the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade with AusAid to deliver a more highly integrated and mutually reinforcing foreign policy, economic diplomacy and assistance program. Fortunately, the increasing focus on whole-of-government work practices will allow us to share skills and Asia capability across the APS. So agencies like my own, whose bread and butter is overseas engagement, can both share our knowledge and learn from other experiences. Some of our biggest posts overseas, Jakarta, Bangkok, New Delhi, Tokyo and Beijing, are at the forefront of this whole-of-government thinking. Typically with greater numbers of staff coming from departments working closely with DFAT colleagues to achieve common goals. And it was pleasing that the recent DFAT capability review made the point that the whole of government work at these posts was best practice. Turning specifically to DFAT, DFAT and other agencies like Immigration, the AFP, Agriculture and Customs that have staff posted or regularly visiting Asia will be at the forefront of driving our engagement in the region. In some ways, we have an inbuilt advantage in DFAT. Dealing with other nations and cultures is our core business, and we tend to attract staff who are interested in the world and increasingly Asia. One of the unsung stories of our overseas missions is the role of our local staff, who embody decades of local experience and expertise. Australian staff, of course, use local staff to multiply their output. The clever ones use local staff to increase and test their understanding of the society and its culture, and hence enhance their own effectiveness. The department has made very deliberate decisions over the years to focus on our own region. We currently have 250 Australian staff based in Asia compared to 89 in Europe. A decade ago, we had 200 in Asia and 129 in Europe. And we've opened 3 new missions in Asia in the past 3 years. We have put a significant effort into beefing up our Asian language capability, increasing the number of language designated positions, and investing heavily in language training for staff, particularly those serving overseas, as well as placing staff in regional organisations and fellow ministries. DFAT has always understood the power of language to engage with other nations. Not only is it a key tool for understanding another culture and the way its people think, it demonstrates respect. It is an important complement to the core skill sets we value: judgment, flexibility and adaptability, leadership, strong communications, persuasiveness, intelligence, to name a few. A skill set not just for DFAT, of course, but the whole APS. In conclusion, it is clear that Australia's ongoing economic prosperity is intimately tied with Asia, but that we will face stiff competition as we build our future there. As the lines between domestic and international policy become ever less distinct, Asia capability will be needed across the APS, not just in traditional institutions such as DFAT. DFAT does bring a number of strengths to engaging with Asia, but it seems clear to me that for Australia to be successful in a highly competitive space, our engagement needs to be a whole of government one. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Another success in sticking to time. We've just put pressure on our last two speakers here. But Professor Deborah Udell, who's going to speak next, has already put her own level of pressure on herself, because if I understand rightly, Deborah has to go at 4:30.
I do.
At 4:30, so you see she's got a strong incentive to also stick to the 10 minutes. Deborah is Professor of Sociology of Education at the University of Birmingham. She's also Director of the Public Service Academy, an initiative that brings together the public service expertise of the College of Social Sciences to engage and inform public service bodies in Birmingham as well as nationally and internationally. She works in the sociology of education, which is concerned on the relationship between policy, practice and inequalities. Thank you very much, Deborah.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Do I need to stand up there? A bit closer to me. Okay. Is that good? Yeah, it's changed, hasn't it? Okay, so thanks ever so much for inviting me. I think that the tone will change a little now, because I'm an academic policy scholar, and my focus is on issues of inequality and in the context of globalisation. So my approach to these questions is somewhat different, but hopefully they'll be of interest. The Public Service Academy, which I lead, is working in a context in the UK of austerity, of enormous rolling back of funding to public services, and we're being asked to talk to local government about public services in that context. Last month I was in Chicago. We have a relationship, Birmingham is a sister city with Chicago. I was in Chicago for two events which feel relevant to this event. One was a conference called Global Urban Challenges that was put on by the Chicago Institute for Global Affairs, funded by a number of US philanthropics and the research universities in Chicago. And there was a big international contingency, and people were talking about what's the role of research universities in facing global urban challenges. The other event that I was at was, again, on questions of global cities at the University of Illinois at Chicago's Great Cities Institute. And why those two events feel so relevant today is that, on the one hand, they were very pragmatically asking, what do cities, what do governments, what do public administration bodies and research universities need to do to be best positioned in these times. The other thing that they were doing, and to some extent in contradiction, and I think perhaps the question of whether or not this is a contradiction that we can reconcile, the other thing that they were doing was grappling with questions of social justice and inequality in the context of shifting global flows of capital and ideals and people and opportunities, and thinking about the relationship between the old industrial, post-industrial, I think it is important how we refer to them, but the old Anglo, perhaps now post-industrial economies and the emerging economies in their regions. So when we were in Chicago, we were talking about Latin America, but it was a look to emerging economies in the region. So one of the things that today has raised for me is the notion of the Asian century as a provocation. Is it a economic opportunity for Australia and the West? Is it or is it an underscoring of the dog days, as Ross Garant book speaks about them, of mature economies which are perhaps in decline? So this morning, David Bellingham raised these questions. He talked about what the Asia century means and does. And that put me in mind of Edward Said's classic book, Orientalism, where he talks about the way in which the West constitutes the East, the way that the West constitutes the East as other, as its exterior. And so I was then thinking about the way that the Asian century as a Western construct produces a particular sort of account of Asia and the Asian person and Asian communities. So I started thinking and looking through the day about the constitutive force of Asian century as a notion, and asking whether those constructions that are talked about in the text Orientalism continue to be in play. The opportunity and the threat, the Occident and the Orient, the West and the East, the us and the them, the unspoken play of whiteness in the construction of an Asian century. David Hannan was just talking about heterogeneity, and quite a few speakers today have spoken about the heterogeneity of Asia. And yet the Asian century continues to risk, and I think I would argue enact a singularizing of Asia and the Asian that we need to be really mindful of and really cautious about. David also talked about, and David, I think I'm agreeing with you, but I think it's taking me in some other directions thinking. We also need to think about the way that the known and the unknown works within the construction of Orientalism, as Said lays it out. So the desire to know and the injunction upon us, the West, to know them, the East, and what that does and what the possibilities for that are, and how we might go about doing that, particularly in the context of enduring racism and racialization. And I think it's really important that we are mindful that across Anglo nations there has been and continues to be persistent racism, and that although those take increasingly subtle forms, they do endure, and we need to be able to address that as we think about these issues. So when I was thinking about knowing Asia and knowing the Asian, I turned to the work of Judith Butler. She writes about, in a text called Giving an Account of Oneself, she writes about what it means to invite those who are typically othered through these sorts of processes to give an account of themselves, but that when we invite the other to give an account of themselves, what we must actually give up is the expectation that that account will satisfy, that we will fully know, and that there is actually a fundamental unknowability, which is about the way in which we think about the person, about the human subject. And she also says in Giving an Account of Oneself that we need to understand through this process the radical dependency that those of us who take the position at the centre have upon those who have been pushed to the margins. Can I have a time check, please? A few minutes, okay. I know I'm going to have to précis. Okay, so what does this mean in relation to policy scholarship? And Helen Sullivan and Sarah Bice's presentation this morning posited the Asia century not as an absolute, but as a provocation. They said that when they started thinking about the conference, the Asian century had a question mark with it. So I was thinking about what that means for policy scholarship, and thinking about the work in particular of Stephen Ball around policy networks. And the work of Jane Kenway around global elites. And so thinking about a shift in thinking from nation states and their relationships to each other to global elites and policy networks that are made up of all sorts of interested bodies, including corporations, but pressure groups, non-government organisations, and in which governments may be minor players in some regards. So I thought that work was really important. I think it also raises the question of thinking about the heterogeneity in a different way. So thinking about the massive inequality inside nations, both in the West and the East, if I'm going to hold on to that distinction. So when we talk about the Asian century, which Asia and which Asians might we be talking about? Jill Tower this afternoon talked about the human and environmental costs of globalization and of massive and rapid urbanization. So what are the implications for mobile, urbanized poor? When I was in Chicago, Kong Cho Ho, who's a professor of sociology in Singapore, was talking about water availability and the implications for public policy of delivering water to the poorest people in Singapore. And Manish Shah, who's the head of the Technical Institute for Social Science in Mumbai, was talking about the shanty towns in Mumbai. So the question of which constituents are we thinking about when we're thinking about the Asia century seems to me really significant. And I think it really reminds us that we need to be really cautious if we find ourselves jealously eyeing what we think other people might have that we might have once had ourselves but are not sure that we're going to have in the future. I guess it's Beck's work on risk and uncertainty in a new economic context. So it takes me back to Judith Butler and her question. She talks about viable lives, which people are recognisable as human and which people get to have viable lives. And so the question of the Asian century raises for me then what sorts of lives are we willing to live? And what sorts of lives do we imagine for those who are most disadvantaged in the Old West, and I'm cheekily including Australia in that, and in emerging economies? And what other forms of life, what other forms of social formation might we as community demand of our public services if we want to think about livable lives for the majority of people and not just for global elites? Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah. So Geraldine Kennett is going to be our last speaker, and this should allow us, roughly speaking, at least half an hour for questions after that, and if necessary, for a couple of minutes from me on dependency ratios. If there's a popular vote, I'll ask you to put your hands up. Or maybe I won't, because they could depress me deeply. Geraldine is Executive Director of the Institute of Public Administration here in Victoria. Those of us who've been with IPA for a while know Geraldine very well. She's a sort of bit of a legendary figure. She controls and manages people like David Hanna and me and directs us around the show. I might say that the IPA is not the Institute of Public Affairs, which has occasionally been confused, a right-wing think tank. Certainly when I was at the Department of Broadband Communications and the Digital Economy a little while back, we managed to send the wrong document, trying to send it to IPA, as in the Institute of Public Administration. We sent it to IPA, the Institute of Public Affairs, and got somebody in the newspaper as a result of that. Wasn't me, so that was important. Geraldine is going to talk generally, I think, about linkages between the Asian century and work for public servants here in Victoria.
Thanks, Peter. I might start by saying that I would like to think that I took a very strategic decision and about my own personal development around Asia, and that is that at the age of 25 I married a Tamil from Malaysia. But I don't think it was a strategic decision at that point in time. I think he was just exceptionally handsome and swept me off my feet. But I will say I'm now absolutely grateful. I still live in an extended family. I have a very modern Tamil family. So at the moment it's more about me trying to learn about Eastern philosophy and being exceptionally interested in both their philosophy and also their performing arts. But at the same time there's this tension in the family about them wanting to learn more about the modern Western culture. And I think it's a little bit about what Deborah was talking about in terms of understanding the other. So I'll talk a little bit about that too as we go forward. A series of reports and forums are really helping us to understand what it is that our public administrators need to know in Victoria. So reports such as the Commonwealth, Australia in the Asia Century, but also various state public service commissions have been writing their own reports about what it is that public servants in their states need to know about Asia and the capabilities required to capitalise on those opportunities. Also conferences such as this and those run by AsiaLink. So to remain relevant, both IPA and also our members need to have a plan for these implications. And what we've found is it's becoming a little easier as time goes on. And in fact, there are more and more discussions like these today, some debates, etc., that are starting to give us some sense of what those opportunities actually are. Some of those look supporting the expansion of Australian imports, but also investment in Australia, capitalising on the value of our public administration IP, but also sharing common problems. So it's not actually a one-way communication, but more around sharing our common problems and common solutions. We think too that public administrators could also learn from the innovations and the approaches used by our Asian counterparts to challenge our thinking about the way we're delivering our public services. So taking advantage of these opportunities actually means that we need to look at a new set of capabilities, such as understanding the history, the economics, and potentially the governance of the way in which our Asian countries are being run. But also, importantly, I believe that many of us in this room may have studied Western classics and philosophy in order to understand the way that we have developed our own laws and ethics and standards. But it's also important to equally study the Eastern philosophies and the way they have developed their societies and also their cultures, to see too how it's impacting on their modern culture. And that's where I reflect back on what Deborah was saying about understanding the other. Wouldn't it be nice if we got to the point where we weren't actually trying to understand the other, but in fact we were not seeing each other as the other, but just as being? We need to also create a pool of administrators that are thinking about international engagement. And we also need to establish more stronger links by sector across the public service. And in that I'm meaning not just the typical trade departments or DFAT or AusAid, but right across all of the other departments that are delivering services in the public service. So as a professional association and also an organisation that delivers lots of professional development, we have a responsibility to lead through these opportunities for our members. Therefore, what IPA is going to do is, and you've seen us starting to do quite a bit of this, and in fact today is a classic example, we're acting as a promoter of relevant Asia capability development activities that other organisations are delivering. We're also going to be a resource for a portal for our members to have a look at any of new innovations and the flow of good ideas that are happening elsewhere. But we also plan to deliver some things of our own, some short courses and practical activities, and I'll talk about those in a moment. That will be one way in which we can certainly show and start the capability development. But also recently we have employed 2 staff that speak Mandarin. In fact, one staff member has been with us for a period of time. She's actually our finance officer. Some of you, if you're not paying your bills, may get a telephone call from her from time to time, but in English, not actually in her Mandarin speaking, and that's Catherine O'Connor. But starting in February next year, our event manager is actually from a Chinese background. We've also established a committee that focuses specifically on what it is that IPA needs to do in the Asia Century, and you've already heard from David Hanna, who chairs that, but John is also on that committee. And the committee is not just public administrators. We have people from the private sector, not-for-profits, consulting firms, and across the public sector to help us really flesh out what are these capabilities that are needed in a rising, dominant Asia society. So the committee has recommended a couple of things. One is that we share solutions with our Asian counterparts, as I've talked about. The other is that we recognise where innovation is actually happening in developing and rising Asian economies, but also to think about broader international engagement as a standard practice for our work. So in terms of doing that, some specific things we've started to already do, and one David spoke about, is offer a one-day practicum for universities and other organisations that may already be hosting delegations in Melbourne. And this practicum actually provides more of a buddy system. So we pair up, this is what we did with the Thais, the people from Thailand, is that we pair up with titles here in Victoria for a one-day forum. Now, at the first part of the forum, they both come together, and it's sharing stories with our fellows from IPA or senior public servants or indeed academics. But then in the second half of the day, they actually go back to their place of work, and they can share more information with other colleagues in their place of work, or indeed doing a site visit. 2 that really worked well is actually both of them were museum educators. And so they were able to really go back and share some of that information. But those that no one misses out, those that we weren't able to actually find a direct match, did a tour of Parliament House, and we see if we can find any MPs looming around Parliament House, or indeed often the speakers in the House, and see whether they would take them on a tour. And that worked really well again with the group from Thai, and more recently we did that with a group from China. The other is that we need to have an understanding of the kind of capabilities that our membership already has. So we're we're actually dovetailing with the Melbourne School of Government's capability study that they're already doing. So linking in with that to get an understanding of our membership's capability in this area. Also establishing an Asia-centric community of practice, so those people that are interested in having a better understanding of how public administration operates in other countries, coming together and sharing their experiences, but also utilising the Victorian Public Service HAMA scholarship winners to come back and present some of their bits and pieces as well. And as I mentioned, we'll be supporting the activities of others that are providing this capability development too. Our seminars, starting with the International Congress and going forward, will have an Asian impact somewhere within it. So it's one of those things, not only do we now cover off on gender and also making sure that we have an Indigenous context in the work that we do, but we're also making sure that we're covering off on any implications for the society in Asia, dominant society. And last but not least, having a bit of fun with this. Some of you may have seen our Yarn Banning exhibition that we did of bureaucrats. And again, we housed this actually at the IPA International Congress. Well, we're going to do a similar one for bureaucrats in an Asian setting. And we'll have that a photographic exhibition that can be used by ourselves at various events, but also, again, by other people that are hosting events in this particular area. So I'll actually leave on that particular note, and I look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Geraldine, if you haven't seen the photos,
They're up in the office. Come and visit.
yeah, that's right. I've seen them at the School of Government, though. I think you used them for the opening. They were around the walls. People didn't see these, and they're just remarkable. You know, this is a customs collector sitting on his, armchair in some small customs outpost somewhere in Pakistan and all that sort of thing. They're quite impressive sort of things by comparison with the comfortable Australian bureaucrat sitting on, a small stool with only one leg because cutbacks and efficiency dividends and all that sort of thing. No, it's not that bad in the public service, honestly. Certainly not the Productivity Commission anyway. So first off, I'd like to thank all of our speakers to keep them for time, which does enable lots of Q&A to take place, certainly up till 4:30 when Deborah has to go. But we could probably keep going a few minutes past that if everybody's keen to do it. So I'm just going to go around the room. I have a question right at the back there. The best thing to do, maybe identify where you come from and who you'd like to ask the question to as well.
Thank you. I'm John Langmore from the Melbourne School of Government. I wanted to ask John Richardson in particular about the number of DFAT staff in Asia. I was shocked to hear it was 250, which is one per 70 million Asians, one per 17 million Asians. Which is an extraordinary ratio. And I know that both recent governments, both Liberal and Labor, have starved DFAT of funding, but I hadn't realised that it was as serious as that. I wonder if you or anyone else on the panel would feel able to comment on this. You probably can't, but maybe the others could.
Do you want to take the fifth, John, or do you want to plead guilty and...
Perhaps at this stage we should turn off the cameras.
Too late for that kind of thing.
I think, John, I appreciate your comments, and you will appreciate that there are limited comments I could make on it. I would note that the department has about 2,500 staff, so 250 is 1 in 10. We have about a third of our staff in total posted overseas. So my point really was that there is a very high representation in Asia. Of course, if we had more resources, we would like to do more. We would increase the number of posts that we have in Asia. There are some very clear candidates that we would actually seek to open very shortly. It's a question, as with everything, of operating within the overall parameters and resource constraints that are set for you as a government agency. I should also have added, though, that the figures I gave did not include those former AusAid staff who are now members of DFAT in the totals, and that would probably increase the proportion and certainly the absolute numbers in Asia quite significantly.
As somebody who's no longer in the government, but I think this is just emblematic of a problem we have in the national discussion, or the lack of the national discussion over so many issues. This is clearly an issue of major importance to us, and yet the entire discussion in Australia around budgets is getting it down, reducing taxes and so on, rather than actually investing seriously in our future. The only way we'll get the sort of change that I think you're saying we ought to have, and I would fully agree with, and John would be very happy with, is if we can actually change the nature of the national discussion into one about investing in our future rather than just reducing the tax burden. That's probably the responsibility of citizens as much as it is to anybody else, but that's where we have to go. But I think it's a good thing, what John's saying is the shift in proportion of our overseas representation from the old parts of our international relations into the new parts in Asia is actually quite significant over the last decade and strongly welcomed.
Peter, can I just make a comment?
Yep.
Sorry, just before we move on to the next question, I just want a bit of a quote that Sashi Trahor talked about when he was at the international conference. He said that there were as many Indian foreign workers in their foreign offices globally as there were Americans actually in the New Delhi office. So your issue is not just pertinent to here, but if you think about it in the context of India actually opening up, they have very, very few foreign offices out globally.
Nick.
Thanks, Peter. John, this is another question to you that actually ties in with John's question as well. I recall that in the Asian Century White Paper, there was a bit of a program of new consulate and embassy facilities signalled for opening across Asia. So I think there's the new ambassador to ASEAN, there's a new Austrade Commission, and consuls in China, Phuket and Mongolia. I'm just wondering if you could give us an update on how those are progressing and if there's any timelines that you can reveal to us today.
The department is in the process of undertaking a global review of our overseas network right at the moment. And it will be looking at several factors. We have had the good fortune of merging with AusAid. This will actually give us a lot more flexibility in a whole series of areas. And so we will be undertaking a review of the total network. As you say, we have opened 3 posts very recently, and the ones that you mentioned are ones which would clearly be very high on any wish list for new posts. But at this stage, it is part of a much broader process of reviewing our total global network, including in the context of the merger of AusAid with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade.
Okay, do we have another question? Says looking around the room.
My name is Fahad Al Sultan from Saudi Arabia. After all this discussion, I'm still confused. What do you mean by Asia? You speak about Asia essentially. Who is in, who is out? Do we mean just Southeast Asia? What about the central of Asia, like Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan? What about the Gulf state, the GCC state, the Arab state, I mean, at the far east? So
Sure.
I think we need a definition. What do we mean by Asia?
Okay. Hands up on the panel. David, do you want to start that?
Well, I think DFAT should start with that one, shouldn't it?
I just thought you might give John a break.
Yeah, no,
I
will actually
here and remembers whether it was defined in the Asian Century White Paper to that level of detail. I don't recall.
Just while John's checking his notes, I did actually go to Wikipedia as I was writing this up, looking for definitions of Asia, and I thought this one was a nice commentary. It's not a definition, but geographical Asia is a cultural artefact of European conceptions of the world being imposed onto other cultures, an imprecise concept causing endemic contention about what it means. Asia is larger and more culturally diverse than Europe. And I can give you the source of that if you like, but I think that sums it up. The earliest definitions of Asia were actually by the ancient Greeks, as I understand it, and that basically started anywhere that we don't go, that way is Asia. Which seems more or less sort of consistent, yeah.
John, you can wait for Deborah.
Sure, thank you.
Absolutely.
I think I would have given that answer, so the difficult conceptual answer, which isn't an answer. But the other thing I think is worth saying is that we think about it in terms of regional blocks that work, that do something. So I was thinking about Jackie Brown's work on regional blocks in higher education. And so I think the interesting question is, what sort of regional block are we imagining, and for what ends, to whose benefit? And it's those questions that then lead to potential provisional answers anyway for a question of who's in and who's out. But that will be mobile. Yeah.
Personally, I don't think it matters very much. I think it's a reasonable designator of a very broad region, and it's a shorthand. As David has highlighted earlier, there are severe limitations to the value of talking about Asia in a cultural, economic, societal, political role, because there are such very significant differences in and amongst the various countries that are broadly grouped as being part of Asia. So I think personally that we should not get too hung up on terminology. It is, I think, for the purposes of our discussion today, a useful designator and recognition of the very significant economic changes which are underway. Now, the rate of those changes differ in and amongst the various countries of Asia and the sub-regions of them. Perhaps I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. I might chuck my 2 cents in as well. As a person who had nothing to do, obviously, with drafting the Australia and the Asia Century White Paper or anything else for that matter, I think the greatest advantage of having undertaken such an exercise is the preemptive communication that whichever, it's not even nationality, whichever grouping is going to dominate in the coming century, it's not the current bunch. And that's, I think, the message that's got across quite effectively, I think, in this country and certainly in my time in North America. Certainly Canadians and the US have this. The US, there's lots of surveys in the US which says now it's clear recognition that its role as ultimate leader is clearly under threat by Asia as a thing. Now, how people define that's, of course, going to variously depend on their own particular sectoral perceptions and things like that. But I think as a communication device, it's been a pretty effective one. Whether that translates into people adjusting for policy, which is far more my concern, I'd question that. I'm not sure whether the information has achieved the kind of shift that you would like to see as a consequence of the amount of effort that went into developing that information. And that's currently a bit of a pity because there are quite significant large policy shifts that could potentially have to be undertaken, not just by us, but by a number of other countries, if adjustment is of the kind that those numbers in the Asia Century White Paper suggest. Another question. We've got ranges of questions over here. So the first to get the microphone, this lady at the back there. And then if there's another microphone, we could come down to here to this gentleman in the brown coat and we'll take him next.
Hi, my name's Anna. I'm from the Victorian Government. I have a question for the panel in the hope of making use of the breadth of wisdom in an intergenerational sense, and I mean that with great respect, not to... there's something to be gained speaking with people of different vintage and so forth.
Even my daughters don't put it that way.
My question relates to whether personal or professionally, were there any points in time for you that really spoke of a change in momentum for Australia to start thinking of Asia in the way that we perhaps do now? Was it Keating? Was it when China's GDP hit double digits? Was it, was there something that was a key marker or series of memorable markers for you? Because I can tell from the other side, my family didn't really start looking at the map south of the Asian continent until we decided to move here, to move our lives here to this region. And that sort of probably started for a lot of our contemporaries in the late 80s and 90s when the governments decided to change its migration policy. So, now South Korea, the number one most desirable country to move to is Australia. So in the last, 20, 30 years, the willingness to learn and to see it as relevant has changed dramatically. And I wanted to get a sense of that from the panel.
I'll throw in. I'll start it. For me, the real shift started with the arrival of large numbers of Vietnamese refugees in Australia. The Vietnam War was a significant event here, but it was distant. The arrival of these people, and I remember I was at university when that was happening. I was in factories earning money in the holidays. And it was the first time I felt compelled to stand up against the Irish Catholic shop stewards in their criticism of the Fraser government's policy on this. And it was a fascinating one because The guy I remember actually was a Korean who was, the factory was much more diverse than you would have thought. There was about 140 people working there. There was about 60 different nationalities represented. About 15 of those were from Asia, very broadly defined. And everyone got on really well with this Korean guy. And I was saying, well, you can't just say you're not going to go with Asian people because you actually like Kim, you know. Always refer to the simple name. And then it turned out that nobody was actually eating fish and chips on a Friday anymore, even though they were Irish Catholics. They were going to the local Chinese takeaway because it was cheaper and better and so on. And the shift had happened, and people hadn't really noticed it. But the arrival of those people actually focused a public debate here, I think, which made it real. The second one, I think, is actually Ross Garnaut's Australian and North Asian Ascendancy, which shifted the policy debate very, very significantly and drove the industry policy and trade policy debates in a way that, in a direction that we simply hadn't been going. There have been lots of other things that have happened. Relationships on iron ore exports to Japan and so on were significant, but those were the two that, for my mind, really marked the initial shift, and there's been a whole lot since.
Thank you. For me, it's really around economic issues. I'm a West Australian, and back in the early 2000s, couldn't understand what was actually happening in the mining industry. My husband and I had invested quite heavily in resources, and our resource shares were going down the tube. So he sold them, and then I think probably a year later had regretted it. And so I started to question then, actually, you know, what is actually happening? And he actually worked for Myer Grace Brothers as a supply chain manager at the time and spent a lot of time in China, and would come back with photographs. And each trip, the cities were just expanding at the most incredible rate. So I had a personal interest to see what was happening there. But at the same time, there was this IT boom shift in India, and a lot of talk around India being branded as the IT capital. And we in fact then made a shift to Melbourne from Perth, and I couldn't believe the amount of students from overseas that were in and around the city, obviously going to good universities like Melbourne and RMIT. So that's when I started to see it more around you know, the economic development of those countries, and its implications were happening right then for Australia.
John, do you want to have a go at this?
Sure. I think there are two dimensions that I would respond to that on. On a personal dimension, I first developed an interest in Asia in 1970. I remember that very clearly because I did a course in Asian history, which I found absolutely fascinating. And at that point identified that clearly Japan was going to become critical to Australia's economic future. So I then embarked on a combined degree at university in economics, politics and Japanese, and spent a good deal of the 1970s in Asia. But I think David's benchmarks in terms of the actual public perceptions in Australia are very accurate. The arrival of the Vietnamese populations enriched the Australian community. I think on the whole that they were absorbed remarkably smoothly into the population mix at the time. That's not to say without difficulties on occasion, but remarkably smoothly. And I think that the Garnaut Australia and the Northeast Asian Ascendancy report acted as a really major shot in the public arm and public consciousness. It provided a major catalyst for people to think about what the implications of the enormous economic developments to the north of us meant for Australia, particularly what they meant for Australian domestic policy. And to some extent, I think, just to pick up your point, Peter, that to me is one of the great advantages of the Asia Century White Paper. It is yet another call to Australia to see what these developments mean for our own domestic organisation, our own domestic perceptions and directions.
And I might just chuck in there I think the shift to export of education services is transformational for some Australians in recognition that Melbourne's particularly an example, because it's not just the education services and the presence of the students, it's actually the accommodation changing entirely, investment in urban structures. This is like, I don't know, it's 12 years old, maybe 14 years old, but we're, I think, the second or third largest now country destination for international education services in the world. And it's shifted the centres of cities in particular by the presence of that university population. And I think that's mentally transformational for a lot of people who otherwise wouldn't have recognised change by reading Ross Garnaut's book, for example. Not they shouldn't have, they should have, but they didn't. Okay, gentleman down here in the brown coat.
So, in reaction to my brother from Saudi Arabia, sometimes I ask myself, who am I? I'm from Bangladesh and I'm a Bengali. We got Nobel Prize in Literature in 1913. There are a lot of Bengali famous filmmakers, also musicians, also there are great leaders. But sometimes I ask why people don't talk about us. There are economists, Nobel laureate, Sen, Dr. Yunus. Then there is a sense of identity crisis in me. I think that in this digital era, Asian century has something is related to digit. Because when we talk about Asian centuries, we talk about double-digit growth. We talk about the growth of China, we talk about the growth of India. And we use the phrase emerging economies. So emerging, you need to be emerging, as you say that some countries within Asia will not be included in the Asian century, and some from outside might be included in the Asian century. So I think the crisis of the Middle East, why India is being talked about, why Pakistan is falling behind. They started the journey in 1947 together. And why people don't talk about Bengalis. Bengali is world's, I think, 6th language. 25 crore people speak in Bengali. But many people I ask in Adelaide, do you know Bengali? Or no, I haven't heard about. So I think to be included in the Asian century for Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, countries in the Middle East, I think we need to conform to some rules. And we need to also target some digits. That's my opinion. Thank you.
Okay, can we go to another question? Gentleman over here.
I'm Yi Jiajin from Fudan University in China, so I appreciate this panel and the talks given by the excellent speakers. So maybe my question is directed to all of you. So we talk about Asian century, and I understand that Asian century is a kind of result of mutual or interactive process. So, to just talk about China, so in our early period of reform and opening up, starting in late 1970s, Chinese government began to welcome the Western capital to encourage exports and imports. So now China became the second largest sovereign economic entity. So now the globalization of China has to have new strategies, new paths. For example, a lot of Chinese entrepreneurs and enterprises, they are highly motivated to do investment in other countries. And there is a lot of barrier to that. For example, so for a lot of proposals by the Chinese enterprises to the American enterprises, the integration or merger, so many of them were denied for different purposes. For example, national security, sometimes ideological purposes. So that's kind of a big problem to limit, the level of globalization for China into the global economic community. So it looks so we need to do something to change the political culture of other countries, or if other countries can change the political culture or even the political structure to accommodate the deepening of China's economy and as well as its politics in the international community. So last year there was a kind of very positive case. So that's a merger by the Chinese overseas oil company, to the Lexus oil company in Canada. So it looks that's a kind of phenomenal case that makes the two countries, get into kind of deeper interdependence. So shall we do something? So just now the speakers talk about mutual knowledge about each other, so we need to learn more from each other, we need to respect more from each other. But the most important and related thing is mutual trust. And it looks to me the government, they can do more. So for example, between the Chinese and Australian governments, can we have some phenomenal cases so we briefly get into that kind of sensitive or very important interdependence, that kind of commitment, so some more things can happen in the future. Thank you.
Okay, who'd like to talk about deeper economic integration, particularly with reference to China, given the question, but you can broaden it to the rest of Asia?
John, do you want to start? Or?
No, David, we're starting with you.
You're starting with me? Okay, starting with me.
So.
Okay.
Well, John can work out the erudite answer.
In many ways, there's a very short answer, which is yes, we should do this. The trick is how. And part of the trick is doing it in a way which still allows for differences of opinion. A clear example is the decisions that the Australian government's made about the involvement of Huawei in the national broadband network. I don't want to go into the details because I actually don't know the details. I don't know the detail of the basis upon which the decision is made, but that's a highly problematic issue for us. I would probably have made a different decision, but then Peter was involved in some of this, so we might want to refer that one to him if he's allowed to talk about it yet. But I think it masks there's a vast degree of integration happening anyway, and investment happening both ways. There's been a lot of Chinese investment in Australia, for example, since the very early days when CITIC first invested in the Portland aluminium smelter, which was a very significant development in its own right, the first offshore investment by a Chinese entity into the West, and has been very successful, I think, on both sides. But a lot of the investment activity is happening below the radar, and what tends to happen is the difficult ones appear above the radar line. Both governments, I think, and indeed the business communities need to start to manage that public perception somewhat more actively, perhaps, than we have. But I think we also need to be working more at governmental levels about understanding what the imperatives on the investment and trade fronts are, and developing protocols around the way we manage this. If it gets to the point where an application is made for Foreign Investment Board approvals and it looks like it's not going to happen, we've probably let that go too far, particularly in a sensitive area. I think we need to be more managing of it than perhaps we have been in the past, and that's partly because of the difference in the governmental systems and those rubbing points that we tend to have. It's easier with some of the other countries like the US and the UK because the systems are very similar and we don't get the same sort of tension points. Where we know there are going to be tension points, then I think there's a responsibility on us to manage them more actively.
I'm going to give Deborah, who's also got to go as well, a chance for the last word. So sorry if there are other questions in the room. Perhaps grab somebody as we go afterwards, but Deborah.
I was going to speak to a really different example, and this is from the UK, but that I think demonstrates the space between policy and public perception. So there's just before I left the UK for Chicago, there was a big media foray about investment, Asian investment in the Olympic Village in London. And the press has been incredibly negative, really whipping up. This was supposed to be Olympic legacy for low-income British families. And Asian people are buying these properties off-plan without ever seeing them. And the tone of the media coverage, I mean, it's kind of it's depressingly old racism, to be honest. And it also, you know, it nods towards an absence of policy around affordable housing that works as well in the UK. But the spaces between the desire and the way these things play out and how they play out in the media and the public consciousness as well, I think is really highlighted by that case.
Okay, so I'd like to thank everybody for their attendance here today, and I'd like to also ask you to thank the panel for their presentations and for their answers to questions.